The dust of the trail, a gritty shroud caking Ethan Vance's worn leather chaps and the sweat-slick flanks of his weary sorrel mare, seemed to carry the very essence of the unforgiving land he traversed for weeks, a land that mirrored the desolate landscape of his own soul. He reined in the mare at the crest of a low rise, the town of Redemption Bluffs sprawling beneath him like a handful of discarded bones bleached white under the relentless afternoon sun. A sun that felt less like a giver of life and more like a molten brand searing itself into the parched earth and the equally parched spirits of those who dared to call this place home. This was it, the end of a pilgrimage fueled not by faith but by a cold, simmering rage that had been his constant companion for 10 long years, ever since the day the news had arrived, carried by a grim-faced rider, that his father, John Vance, a man whose laughter had once been as warm and encompassing as a hearth fire in deep winter, had fallen in a duel, his life extinguished by a bullet from Marcus Thorne's gun. The name Thorne had since been a splinter embedded deep in Ethan's heart, a festering wound that no amount of time or distance could heal. Only one act could offer any solace, any semblance of peace: vengeance. Not against Marcus Thorne, for the man was already dust himself, claimed by some frontier fever years ago, but against his blood, his legacy, his son Liam Thorne, who, by all accounts Ethan had painstakingly gathered, still resided here, a man grown in the shadow of his father's violent reputation. Ethan's hand, calloused and strong from years of ranch work and solitary practice with the Colt peacemaker that had once been his father's, instinctively drifted to the worn wooden grip of the pistol holstered low on his hip, the metal cool and familiar against his touch, a silent promise. He carried not just the gun, but the weight of his mother's silent tears, the abrupt and brutal end of his own childhood, the hollowness that had consumed his youth, shaping him into this solitary figure, driven by a singular, all-consuming purpose. The wind, a dry, mournful sigh, whispered through the sparse, brittle grass, carrying with it the faint, distant sounds of the town, a dog's bark, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, a snatch of raucous laughter from the saloon sounds of life that felt alien to him, a mockery of the stillness that had settled in his own heart. His father had been a good man, a fair man, or so Ethan had always believed. His memories painted in the golden hues of a child's adoration. The duel, the reasons for it, remained shrouded in the whispers and conjectures of others, a tapestry of half-truths and unspoken grievances that Ethan had never fully unraveled, choosing instead to focus on the undeniable fact of his loss, the gaping void left by his father's absence. He urged the mare forward, down the gentle slope, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fixed on the town, each building, each dusty street, a potential stage for the final act of a tragedy that had begun long before he understood its script. He was a ghost returning to haunt the living, a debt collector whose currency was pain, and the air itself seemed to grow heavy, charged with the unspoken tension of his arrival, as if the very dust motes danced with a premonition of conflict. The town itself appeared weary, its wooden storefronts faded and peeling, the boardwalks uneven and treacherous in places, a testament to the harshness of a life eked out at the edge of civilization where hope was a fragile commodity, easily shattered by the next drought, the next raid, or the next bullet. As he rode down the main street, heads turned, conversations lulled, the eyes of strangers assessing him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, the silent language of the frontier where a newcomer could mean opportunity or danger in equal measure. He felt their gazes like physical touches, some indifferent, some wary, a few openly hostile, and he returned them with a stoic impassivity that had become his shield against the world. His emotions locked away, too precious, too raw to expose. His destination was the livery stable, but his gaze scanned every face, every doorway, searching for a sign, a name, a glimpse of the man whose existence was an affront to his father's memory. The name Thorne was synonymous with power in this region. Ethan knew that much, a power built on ruthlessness and ambition, and Liam, he'd heard, had not let his father's legacy diminish. This wasn't just about a son avenging a father. It was about challenging an entrenched dynasty, a prospect that would have deterred a less resolute man. But Ethan's resolve was forged in grief, tempered by years of lonely determination, and it was as unyielding as the granite peaks that loomed in the distant west. He pictured Liam Thorne in his mind, a man he'd never seen, constructing him from scraps of rumor. Tall like his father, with the same cold eyes, a man who took what he wanted, who expected obedience, who perhaps even gloried in the fear his family name inspired. The thought tightened the knot of anger in Ethan's gut, a familiar ache that had driven him across countless miles. He dismounted in front of the livery, the scent of hay and horses a small, almost forgotten comfort from a life he'd left behind. As he handed the reins to a taciturn hostler, his eyes caught a movement across the street, a figure stepping out of the mercantile, a man who paused, his gaze sweeping the street, settling for a moment on Ethan with an unnerving intensity before he turned and walked on. He was of an age with Ethan, well-dressed for this dusty outpost, with an air of confident authority. Was this him? Was this Liam Thorne? The man's face was too distant to discern features clearly, but the way he carried himself, the subtle deference shown by a townsman who tipped his hat as he passed, sent a jolt through Ethan, a tremor of recognition that was more instinct than certainty. The air crackled, the ordinary sounds of the town fading into a dull hum as Ethan's focus narrowed, the world shrinking to that receding figure and the pounding of his own heart. A drumbeat heralding a confrontation that felt as inevitable as the setting of that brutal, unforgiving sun. He had arrived, and the first thread of his grim tapestry was now visibly in place, the pattern of vengeance beginning to take shape in the dusty streets of Redemption Bluffs, a place that might offer him his due, or swallow him whole just as it had his father. The long winter of his waiting was indeed over, but whether this thaw would bring the cleansing flood of justice or simply mire him deeper in the cold mud of unending sorrow, remained a terrifying, unanswered question, hanging heavy as the thunderheads that were beginning to gather on the far horizon, mirroring the storm brewing within his own chest. The name of the town felt like a bitter irony, for redemption was the last thing on Ethan Vance's mind. He had come for retribution, a stark and final accounting, and the slight narrowing of his eyes as he watched the man disappear around a corner was a silent vow that this accounting would be met, no matter the cost to himself or to the fragile peace of this isolated, watchful town. He was a spark, and this town was tinder, and the wind of fate was beginning to pick up, threatening to fan that spark into a consuming fire. The following morning, Ethan set about the grim task of reconnaissance, his movements quiet and deliberate, his senses honed by years of solitude and the ever-present awareness of his purpose. He needed to understand the terrain, not just the physical layout of Redemption Bluffs, but the intricate web of alliances, fears, and loyalties that held the town together, the currents that flowed beneath its placid surface. He learned quickly that the name Thorne was spoken with a mixture of respect and trepidation. Liam Thorne owned the largest ranch in the valley, the sprawling Bar M, inherited from Marcus, and his influence extended into nearly every facet of the town's commerce and governance. Men who worked for him were easily identifiable by their swagger, a borrowed confidence that seemed to grant them license for minor tyrannies. Ethan found a room at the less reputable of the town's two boarding houses, a place where questions were seldom asked and discretion was a valued, if unspoken, currency. It was here, in the dim, sparsely furnished common room, nursing a cup of weak, bitter coffee, that he first truly encountered Alara. She wasn't a resident, but delivered fresh bread and sometimes eggs from a small holding she worked a few miles out of town. Her face often smudged with dirt, her hands strong and capable. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed out of place amidst the rough-hewn masculinity of her surroundings. Yet she commanded a subtle respect, her direct gaze and straightforward manner deflecting any untoward advances. She had noticed him the day before, another solitary figure in a town that seemed to collect them. But it was his stillness, the deep well of sorrow in his eyes that even his hardened exterior couldn't entirely conceal, that caught her attention. She approached his table, not with the coyness of some of the town's women, but with a simple, almost abrupt, "You're new here. Haven't seen you before." Her voice was low, with a hint of a rasp, like stones smoothed by a river. Ethan looked up, surprised by the directness. Her eyes were the color of rich earth after a rain, steady and discerning. "Just passin' through," he offered, the lie feeling clumsy on his tongue. Alara nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Most folks who are just passing through don't look like they're carrying the weight of the world, or waitin' for it to fall on them. Her perceptiveness was unnerving. "Don't know what you mean," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though a flicker of something, perhaps annoyance or a grudging respect, tightened his jaw. She placed a small loaf of dark bread on his table. "On the house. You look like you could use something solid," before he could refuse or thank her. She'd moved on, her brief presence leaving an unexpected ripple in the stagnant pool of his thoughts. Later that day, Ethan found himself near the Thorn Ranch, a vast expanse of land that stretched as far as the eye could see, its fences well maintained, its herds of cattle fat and plentiful, a stark contrast to the struggling homesteads he'd passed on his journey. He wasn't consciously seeking a confrontation yet, merely observing, when a group of riders, men by the brand on their horses, intercepted him on the dusty track leading back towards town. Their leader, a burly man with a perpetually sneering expression named Jedediah Jed Stone, who Ethan later learned was Liam Thorne's foreman, reined in his horse, blocking Ethan's path. "This is Thorn land, stranger. You lost." Jed's tone was openly hostile, his hand resting meaningfully on the butt of his pistol. Ethan met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. "Just admiring the view. Didn't see any signs." "The brand on those cattle is sign enough," Jed growled, his men fanning out slightly, a clear intimidation tactic. "We don't take kindly to trespassers, or those asking too many questions about Mr. Thorne." The air grew thick with unspoken threat. Ethan felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the readiness for conflict that had become second nature. He could see the fight in Jed's eyes, the eagerness for violence that some men wore like a badge. But a brawl here now wouldn't serve his purpose. "No trouble intended," Ethan said, his voice even, betraying none of the tension coiling within him. "Just making my way back to town." He made to ride around them, but Jed shifted his horse again. "What's your business in Redemption Bluffs, friend? You don't look like a man looking for honest work." "My business is my own," Ethan replied, his voice dropping a register, a subtle warning. For a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable, the air crackling. Then, from the direction of the ranch house, a lone rider approached at a canter. As he drew closer, Ethan recognized the build, the confident set of the shoulders. It was the man he'd seen leaving the mercantile the day before, the man he suspected was Liam Thorne. Liam reined in beside Jed, his gaze sweeping over Ethan, cool and appraising. He was younger than Ethan had perhaps pictured his father's killer's son, perhaps late 20s, with dark hair and eyes that were startlingly clear, not cold as rumor suggested, but sharp, intelligent. "Something wrong here, Jed?" Liam's voice was calm, authoritative, lacking the overt aggression of his foreman, yet carrying an undeniable weight. Jed straightened. "Just check in on this fella, Mr. Thorne. Found him on our land." Liam Thorne's eyes lingered on Ethan. "This is private property. The main road to town is yonder," he gestured vaguely. There was no malice in his tone, just a statement of fact. Yet Ethan felt a surge of the old anger. This man, living comfortably on land perhaps bought with the blood money from his father's demise, or at least, land that represented the continued prosperity of a family that had destroyed his own. "I'll be sure to stick to it," Ethan said, his voice tight. Liam nodded once, then turned his horse. "See that you do. Jed, let's ride." As they rode off, Jed cast a backward glance at Ethan, a look that promised future trouble. Ethan watched them go, his hand clenching and unclenching by his side. Seeing Liam Thorne up close, hearing his voice, had solidified something within him, a hardening of his resolve, yet also, unsettlingly, a flicker of something more complex. Thorne hadn't been the snarling brute he'd half expected. He'd been civil, controlled. It was a dissonance that Ethan hadn't anticipated, a small crack in the simple, black and white narrative of vengeance he'd constructed. Later that evening, back in the dim common room, Elara found him again, her expression knowing. "Heard you had a run-in with Jed Stone and Thorne himself," she said, setting down another cup of coffee, this time one he'd paid for. "News travels fast in a town this size," Ethan grunted non-committally. They don't like strangers. They don't like anyone who might disrupt their order, Alara corrected gently. Liam Thorne values stability above all else. His father, Marcus, built their empire through less stable means. Liam tries to maintain it with a firmer, quieter hand. She paused, then added, her voice softer. This path you're on, whatever it is, be careful. Redemption Bluffs has a way of burying those who dig too deep for things best left undisturbed. I lost my own father young, not to a duel, but to the harshness of this land and the greed of men who thought they were more powerful than nature or decency. Revenge, it's a bitter crop, rarely yields what you hope. Her words, spoken with a quiet sorrow that resonated with his own, were a small seed of doubt, or perhaps a warning he was not yet ready to heed. He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not just a woman delivering bread, but someone who understood loss, who had faced adversity and chosen not bitterness, but a quiet endurance, a fierce, gentle strength. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a stirring of something other than anger or grief, a faint, almost imperceptible pull towards connection, a human warmth in the vast coldness of his quest. It was a dangerous feeling, one he tried to push away, for his path was solitary, his purpose fixed. Yet, Alara's presence, her unsolicited kindness and her stark, honest words, lingered in his mind long after she had gone. A small, flickering candle in the profound darkness he carried within him, subtly altering the shadows, making him question, just for a moment, the unyielding certainty of his grim pilgrimage. The tension was no longer just between him and the memory of Marcus Thorne, or the person of Liam Thorne. It was now also within him, a silent battle between the ghosts of his past and the unexpected, fragile possibility of a different kind of future, a future he hadn't dared to even imagine. The days that followed settled into a tense rhythm of observation and introspection for Ethan Vance. He made a show of looking for temporary work, enough to justify his presence in Redemption Bluffs without raising undue suspicion, though Jed Stone and his Bar M crew watched him with an unblinking, predatory focus whenever their paths crossed. Ethan, however, was more interested in Liam Thorne. He saw him infrequently, a glimpse in town conducting business at the bank, a distant figure on horseback overseeing work on his vast ranch, a man who moved with an air of quiet, almost reluctant authority. Liam was not the swaggering bully his father, Marcus, had reportedly been. He was reserved, his words measured, his actions seemingly calculated for efficiency and control rather than overt displays of power. This subtlety was, in its own way, more disconcerting to Ethan than open aggression would have been. It made Liam a more difficult target to define, to hate with the pure, uncomplicated venom he had nurtured for so long. Ethan learned that Liam had been sent back east for schooling as a boy, returning only after his father's death to take up the reins of the Thorne Empire. Some older townsfolk whispered that Liam was different from Marcus, that he sought to legitimize the Thorne name, to move beyond the often brutal means by which his father had carved out his domain. Others scoffed, claiming the apple never fell far from the tree, that Liam's polish was merely a veneer over the same ruthless core. Ethan found himself caught between these narratives. His own carefully constructed image of Liam Thorne, the villainous scion, beginning to fray at the edges. His interactions with Alara, though infrequent, became small anchors in his otherwise turbulent existence. She never pressed him about his past or his intentions, but her presence was a quiet challenge to his isolation. He'd find her at the edge of town some mornings, tending her small, meticulously kept garden that supplied her baking, her brow furrowed in concentration as she coaxed life from the stubborn soil. Once, he found her struggling to mend a broken fence post, the wood rotten and unyielding. Without a word, he'd taken the tools from her, his strong hands making quick work of the repair. She'd watched him, a faint blush on her sun-kissed cheeks, and when he was done, she'd simply said, "Thank you, Ethan." The sound of his name on her lips, spoken with such simple sincerity, had felt strangely intimate. "It was nothing," he'd mumbled, uncomfortable with the flicker of warmth her gratitude ignited. "It was something to me," she'd replied, her gaze steady, holding his for a moment longer than necessary, making him feel seen in a way he hadn't been for years, not as the son of a dead man, not as a threat, but simply as a man. These small moments were like cracks of light in a darkened room, illuminating corners of himself he'd thought long dead. He began to practice with his father's Colt more diligently, seeking out secluded spots in the foothills beyond the town. The sharp crack of the shots echoing in the vast emptiness, each bullet a release of pent-up frustration, grief, and a growing, unsettling confusion. His father had taught him to shoot, not for sport, but for defense, a grim necessity in a land where law was often a distant concept. He remembered his father's hands, large and gentle, guiding his own smaller ones, the smell of gun oil and leather, the quiet patience in his voice. "A gun is a tool, Ethan," John Vance had said. "A dangerous one. You only ever draw it if you mean to use it, and you only ever use it if there's no other way. Remember that, son." No other way. The memory was a sharp pang, a stark contrast to the vengeful purpose that now guided his hand. Was this truly the only way? The question, unbidden, began to surface more frequently, a traitorous whisper in the fortress of his resolve. He started to seek out snippets of his father's past in Redemption Bluffs, though John Vance had only been in the area for a short time before the fatal duel. An old-timer at the saloon, his memory lubricated by a shot of Ethan's whiskey, recalled John as a quiet man, good with cards, but with a sorrowful look about him, like he was carrying a heavy past. "Same as you, young fella." Another, the town's aging doctor who had pronounced John Vance dead, spoke of Marcus Thorne's fiery temper and possessiveness over anything he considered his land, cattle, even people. The duel, he'd heard, was over a disputed claim, a common enough spark for violence, but there were whispers of something more personal, a woman perhaps, though no one seemed to know for sure. Each fragment of information added another layer of complexity to a story Ethan had always seen in stark, simple terms. His father wasn't just a sainted martyr, and Marcus Thorne wasn't just a soulless killer. They were men, flawed and driven by passions and needs that Ethan was only now beginning to glimpse. The world was not black and white, but 1,000 shades of gray, and this realization was profoundly unsettling. He saw Liam Thorne one afternoon at the creek, watering his horse, alone for once. Ethan was hidden in a copse of cottonwoods, his initial instinct of predatory tightening, the urge to confront him, to finally speak the words of challenge that burned on his tongue. But he hesitated. Thorne looked tired. There were lines of strain around his eyes that Ethan hadn't noticed from a distance. He wasn't exuding power or arrogance, just a quiet weariness as he stared into the flowing water, lost in thought. The image didn't fit the narrative. This Liam Thorne looked less like a man to be hated and more like a man burdened by a legacy he hadn't chosen. The moment passed, Thorne mounted and rode off, oblivious to Ethan's scrutiny, but the hesitation lingered, a seed of doubt that Alara's quiet wisdom and his own unwelcome observations were nurturing into something that felt dangerously like empathy, or at least a reluctant understanding. The thought that Liam Thorne might be as much a victim of his father's past as Ethan was of his own was a profoundly disturbing one, for it threatened to unravel the very foundation of his quest, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of a decade wasted on hatred. The internal conflict raged, a silent, desperate battle being waged in the desolate landscape of his heart, far more challenging than any physical confrontation he had yet faced. A sudden late spring storm, a ferocious outburst of nature's fury, descended upon Redemption Bluffs one afternoon, transforming the dusty streets into churning rivers of mud and trapping Ethan in the small, cluttered space of Alara's cabin. He'd been returning from his solitary shooting practice in the hills when the sky, a bruised and angry purple, had unleashed its torrent. Alara's small holding was the nearest shelter, and she'd seen him struggling through the downpour, beckoning him in with a wave from her doorway, her usual composure slightly ruffled by the wind whipping her hair around her face. The cabin was tiny, but warm and dry, filled with the comforting aroma of baking bread and drying herbs. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. It was an oasis of simple domesticity, a stark contrast to the harshness of the world outside and the turmoil within Ethan. Awkwardly, he accepted a dry blanket and a tin cup of hot, sweet tea, the warmth seeping into his chilled bones. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the roar of the wind and rain against the roof and the crackle of the fire. It was Alara who finally spoke, her voice soft, barely audible above the storm. My mother used to say storms were the earth's way of washing away the old, making way for the new. Ethan looked at her, her profile illuminated by the firelight. There was a pensiveness in her expression, a hint of her own past sorrows. Sometimes, he said, his voice rough, some things can't be washed away. They just get driven deeper. Alara turned to him, her gaze direct and searching. Like grief? Or anger? He didn't answer, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. She didn't press, instead rising to check the bread baking in a small Dutch oven by the fire. The simple, domestic act, her calm movements, the quiet efficiency with which she managed her small world, filled him with a strange mixture of longing and unease. This was the kind of peace he'd thought forever lost to him. As the storm raged on, cutting them off from the rest of the world, a fragile intimacy began to develop between them. Alara spoke a little of her life, of her parents who had come west with dreams of a small farm, dreams that had withered under the harsh sun and harder luck. Her father had died from a fever, her mother from a broken heart not long after, leaving Alara, barely a woman, to fend for herself. She'd clung to their small piece of land, a stubborn refusal to let their dreams die completely, eking out a living with her garden, her chickens, and her baking. There was no self-pity in her telling, only a quiet resilience that Ethan found himself deeply admiring. He, in turn, found himself speaking of his own father, not of the duel, but of the man himself, his kindness, his laughter, the way he could tell a story that would make you forget your troubles. It was the most he'd spoken of his father to anyone in years, the words feeling rusty and unfamiliar, yet also a profound relief, like lancing a wound. Alara listened, her expression gentle, understanding. "He sounds like a good man," she said softly when he fell silent. "It's a heavy thing. To lose someone like that." Her empathy was a balm, unexpected and deeply affecting. He realized, with a jolt, how starved he'd been for simple human connection, for someone to see beyond the wall of ice he'd built around himself. The conversation drifted, and Alara mentioned, almost casually, that Liam Thorne had, a few years back, quietly settled a long-standing water rights dispute that his father, Marcus, had instigated with several smaller homesteaders, including her own parents' original claim. Marcus had used his power to divert water, nearly ruining them. Liam, upon taking over, had reviewed the situation and proposed a fairer share, against the advice of some of his father's old cronies like Jed Stone. "He didn't have to do it," Alara said, her brow furrowed as if still puzzled by the act. "It cost him, both in water and in the loyalty of some of his father's men. Some say he did it for show, to look respectable. Others say he's not his father." Ethan listened, a knot tightening in his stomach. This piece of information, this act of fairness, of restitution, directly contradicted the image of Liam Thorne he so desperately needed to maintain. If Liam was capable of such an act, was he truly the monster Ethan had painted him to be? Could the son be so different from the father whose sins Ethan had laid at his door? The storm began to subside as evening approached, the rain softening to a gentle patter, the wind sighing itself out. A sliver of pale light broke through the clouds in the west, painting the wet landscape in hues of silver and gray. "Looks like it's passing," Ethan said, rising, the blanket feeling suddenly too heavy, the warmth of the cabin too comfortable, too dangerous. He needed to leave, to return to the cold clarity of his purpose before this unexpected thaw melted his resolve completely. Alara walked him to the door. The air was fresh and clean, the world washed new, just as her mother had said. "Thank you for the shelter," he said, his voice still gruff, but with an undertone of sincerity. "And the tea," she smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes, making them sparkle. "Anytime, Ethan. Be careful on your way back. The ground will be slick," he nodded, then hesitated. There was something he needed to ask, a question prompted by the day's revelations, by the story of the water rights. "Alara," he began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase it. Do you think a man can escape his father's shadow? His father's sins. Her smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. She looked out at the newly cleansed world, then back at him, her gaze steady and profound. I think, she said slowly, a man makes his own choices, Ethan, every day. It's the choices that define him, not the blood in his veins or the name he carries. But sometimes, the world doesn't make it easy to see that. Her words hung in the air between them. A quiet challenge, a profound truth that resonated deep within him. He nodded again, unable to find a reply, then turned and walked out into the fading light, the mud squelching under his boots. The physical storm had passed, but the storm within Ethan Vance raged on, more turbulent than ever, fueled now by a confusing mix of gratitude, admiration, and a terrifying, burgeoning doubt about the very nature of his quest. Liam Thorne, the symbol of all he'd lost, was becoming a more complex figure, a man capable of both inheriting a tainted legacy and, perhaps, trying to reshape it. And Alara, with her quiet strength and unexpected wisdom, was becoming a beacon, illuminating a path away from the darkness he'd inhabited for so long, a path he wasn't sure he was brave enough or willing enough to take. The moral dilemma was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, two faces in fact, Liam's unexpectedly human one, and Alara's, full of a quiet, resilient hope that was both alluring and deeply unsettling to his avenging heart. The fragile equilibrium Ethan had found, a tense balance between his ingrained mission and the nascent doubts cultivated by Alara's influence and Liam Thorne's ambiguous actions, was shattered with the sudden brutality characteristic of life on the frontier. It began not with a direct confrontation with Liam, but with an act of petty malice from Jed Stone, Liam's foreman, a man who seemed to embody all the crude aggression of Marcus Thorne's era. Alara had a small, favored hen, a speckled creature that would often follow her around her yard like a pet, a small spot of cheer in her otherwise solitary existence. One morning, Ethan, on his way to the creek for water, saw Jed Stone and two of his Bar M cronies riding past Alara's small holding. He heard their coarse laughter, then a squawk of distress. By the time Ethan reached a vantage point, they were riding away, and Alara was kneeling in her yard, cradling the broken, lifeless body of the hen, a single, bright red feather stuck to Stone's boot as he disappeared down the track. Alara didn't weep, but her face was a mask of pale, controlled sorrow, her eyes glittering with unshed tears and a quiet fury that Ethan recognized, for it mirrored his own. The act was senseless, cruel, a deliberate provocation aimed not just at Alara, but, Ethan suspected, indirectly at him, a way for Stone to assert his dominance and remind Ethan of the Thorns' reach. That evening, Ethan found Stone in the saloon, boasting loudly about teaching the little homesteader a lesson about whose land this really is, implying Alara's small plot was an eyesore too close to Thorn territory. The casual cruelty, the smug satisfaction on Stone's face, snapped something within Ethan. The carefully constructed dam of his restraint, already weakened by conflicting emotions, finally broke. He walked over to Stone's table, his movements economical, his face devoid of expression, but his eyes were like chips of ice. Stone. Ethan's voice was quiet, yet it cut through the saloon's din, silencing the conversations around them. You owe Miss Alara an apology, and recompense for what you did. Stone, surprised by the direct confrontation, initially sneered. Well, if it ain't the stranger, meddlin' in things that ain't your concern. What's it to you, her pet chicken? His cronies snickered. It's about decency, Ethan said, his voice still low, but with an edge that promised violence. Something you clearly know nothing about. Stone's face flushed with anger. He pushed back his chair and stood, his hand dropping to his gun. You calling me out, stranger? Over a damn chicken. I'm calling you out for being a bully and a coward, Ethan stated, his gaze unwavering. The saloon went deathly quiet. This was it, the spark. But before Stone could draw, a voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the tension. That's enough. Jed Liam Thorne stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on his foreman, then shifting to Ethan. He had clearly heard the exchange. "This is a private matter, Mr. Thorne," Stone growled, reluctant to back down in front of an audience. "It becomes my matter when my foreman causes trouble in town and drags my name into it," Liam said coolly. He walked further into the saloon, his presence commanding attention. He looked at Ethan. "What Stone did was wrong. He will apologize to Miss Alara, and he will compensate her for the loss. I'll see to it personally." Stone looked mutinous, but a sharp glance from Liam silenced his protest. Liam then turned back to Ethan. "As for you, Vance, I know your name, and I know why you're here. You've been biding your time, watching, waiting. If you have an issue with my family, with my father, then your quarrel is with me, not my men, and certainly not with innocent townsfolk or their chickens." The directness was startling. The moment Ethan had been working towards, the confrontation he'd envisioned for a decade, was suddenly upon him, instigated not by his own careful planning, but by a thug's petty cruelty and Liam Thorne's unexpected intervention. All the complex emotions, the doubts, the reluctant empathy, seemed to vanish, replaced by the old, familiar surge of adrenaline, the singular focus of his ingrained purpose. "My quarrel is indeed with you, Thorne," Ethan said, his voice resonating with the weight of 10 years of grief and anger. "Your father killed mine. An unarmed man. By some accounts he ignored the gasps from the onlookers." His eyes locked on Liam's. "That's a lie," Liam said, his voice tight, a flicker of anger finally showing in his eyes. "My father was many things, but he met his opponents face to face. It was a fair duel. Your father knew the risks. There's nothing fair about a man losing his life, a wife losing her husband, a son losing his father," Ethan retorted, his hand drifting instinctively towards his own Colt. "If you believe an injustice was done, Vance," Liam said, his own hand conspicuously empty, away from his sidearm, "then what is it you propose to do about it? More killing? More grief? Will that balance the scales for you?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Ethan's very soul. This was not how he had imagined it. He had envisioned a cold, righteous pronouncement of vengeance, a formal challenge delivered on his own terms. Instead, he was here, in a crowded saloon, his motives laid bare, being questioned by the very man he sought to destroy. But the die was cast. The momentum was unstoppable. "I propose," Ethan said, his voice hard, "that you meet me, Thorne, as your father met mine. A duel. To settle this debt." Once and for all, a collective intake of breath swept through the saloon. Dueling was not as common as it once was, and a formal challenge between two prominent figures. One the established power, the other a mysterious newcomer with a burning grievance, was a momentous event. Liam Thorne stared at Ethan, his expression unreadable for a long moment. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Alara, who had heard the commotion and arrived at the saloon door, watched with wide, fearful eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth. Liam's gaze flickered to her, then back to Ethan. Finally, he spoke, his voice devoid of emotion. "If a duel is what you demand to satisfy your honor, Vance, then a duel you shall have. Dawn 3 days from now, at Whisper Creek, where they say your father fell. Does that meet your requirements for settling the debt?" Ethan felt a cold triumph, yet also a strange hollowness. The words were spoken. The point of no return had been reached. "It does," he said, his voice a low growl. Liam Thorne simply nodded once, then turned and walked out of the saloon, Jed Stone and his chastened men trailing behind him. The crowd erupted in hushed, excited whispers. Ethan stood alone, the weight of his decision settling upon him. He had made his challenge. He had set in motion the final act. He caught Alara's eye across the room. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of fear, disappointment, and a deep, sorrowful understanding. He had chosen his path, the path of violence, the path of his father. And as he walked out of the saloon into the cool night air, the cheers and jeers of the crowd fading behind him, he wondered if, in seeking to avenge one death, he was merely paving the way for another, perhaps his own, or perhaps, even more tragically, the death of the nascent hope that had so unexpectedly begun to stir within him. The town of Redemption Bluffs, once a distant, abstract stage for his vengeance, was now poised to become the very ground where his fate, and Liam Thorne's, would be irrevocably decided. The 3 days that followed Ethan's challenge to Liam Thorne were like a lifetime compressed into an agonizingly slow passage of hours, each one heavy with the weight of impending confrontation. Redemption Bluffs buzzed with a nervous energy, a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine fear. Duels were not entertainment. They were deadly serious affairs that often left a lasting scar on a community, regardless of the outcome. For Ethan, these days were a crucible. The initial cold triumph of having his challenge accepted soon gave way to a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He retreated into himself, finding a grim solace in the familiar rituals of preparing his weapon, his father's Colt Peacemaker. He cleaned and oiled it with meticulous care, the scent of the gun oil sharp and evocative, conjuring vivid memories of John Vance's strong, capable hands, the way he would patiently explain the mechanism, the responsibility that came with handling such a deadly instrument. Each click of the cylinder, each smooth passage of the cleaning rod, was a step closer to the moment when this gun, once a symbol of his father's protection, would become an agent of Ethan's vengeance. He practiced his draw in the seclusion of the foothills, sending bullets into a weathered tree stump, the impacts echoing the hollow thud in his own chest. He was fast, his reflexes honed by years of solitary obsession, but speed alone wouldn't determine the outcome. It was the will, the cold resolve to take a life that would matter most. And it was precisely this resolve that felt increasingly frayed. The image of Liam Thorne's face, not as a monstrous villain, but as a man burdened by his own legacy, a man capable of fairness, kept intruding upon his thoughts. And then there was Alara. He avoided her, knowing that her presence, her quiet disapproval, her unspoken plea for him to choose a different path, would only deepen his internal conflict. But her influence was undeniable. Her words about choices defining a man, not his bloodline, echoed in the silence of his lonely room at the boarding house. He found himself replaying their conversations, her simple wisdom a stark contrast to the complex, tangled knot of his own grief and anger. One evening, unable to bear the confines of his room or the suffocating weight of his thoughts, he walked to the edge of town, towards the small cemetery where, he'd been told, his father was buried in an unmarked grave, another casualty of the frontier's harsh justice. He found the spot, a patch of barren earth distinguished only by a few weathered stones someone had placed there long ago. There were no flowers, no epitaph, just the silent testimony of neglect. Kneeling beside it, Ethan felt a profound wave of sorrow, not the sharp, vengeful anger that had fueled him for so long, but a deep, aching sadness for the man he had barely known as an adult, for the life unlived, for the potential extinguished. "What would you have me do, father?" he whispered into the gathering dusk, the question carried away by the mournful prairie wind. "Is this what you would want? More blood spilled in your name?" The silence was his only answer, a vast, indifferent silence that offered no comfort, no guidance. As he rose to leave, he saw a figure standing a short distance away, half hidden in the shadows of a gnarled juniper tree. It was Alara. She had a small posy of wildflowers in her hand. She walked towards him, her expression gentle, full of a sorrow that mirrored his own. "I come here sometimes," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the stillness, "to remember those the world forgets." She knelt and placed the wildflowers on the unmarked grave. He shouldn't be forgotten. Ethan watched her, his throat tight. Her simple act of kindness, of remembrance for a man she had never known, was more moving than any grand gesture could have been. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why do you care?" Alara looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the fading light. "Because loss is a universal language, Ethan. And because no one should have to bear it alone. And because—" She hesitated, then continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "Because I see the good in you, Ethan Vance, buried deep beneath all that pain. I don't want to see it extinguished too." They stood in silence for a long moment, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. Then, Alara reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out something small, pressing it into his hand. It was a smoothly polished river stone, cool and solid. "My mother gave this to me when my father died," she said. "She told me to hold on to it when the world felt like it was spinning too fast, to remember that even in the midst of chaos, there are things that are solid, things that endure. Like the earth. Like hope." Ethan looked down at the stone in his palm, its simple weight a surprising comfort. He wanted to tell her then, to confess the turmoil in his soul, to ask her if there was another way, but the words wouldn't come. The path he was on was too deeply ingrained, the promise he'd made to himself too binding. He could only nod, a curt, inadequate gesture of thanks. "Be careful, Ethan," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "Please." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his ghosts and the small, smooth stone that felt like both a blessing and a curse. Meanwhile, the town whispered about Liam Thorne. Some said he was a fool to accept the challenge, that he should have had Ethan arrested or run out of town. Others admired his courage, his willingness to meet the challenge head-on, just as his father would have. Liam himself remained a remote figure, seen only briefly, his expression unreadable. Jed Stone, however, was visibly agitated, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous aggression. He tried to dissuade Liam, arguing that Ethan Vance was a nobody, a drifter not worth the risk. But Liam had been adamant. The debt, he'd said, was his to settle, not Stone's. The full story of the original duel between John Vance and Marcus Thorne began to circulate anew, embellished with each telling. Some said Vance had cheated Thorne at cards, others that he'd insulted Thorne's wife. The most persistent rumor, however, involved a disputed mining claim, a rich vein of silver that both men had believed was theirs. Marcus Thorne, known for his possessiveness and quick temper, had allegedly forced the confrontation, giving Vance little choice but to defend his honor, or what was left of it. John Vance, it was said, had been a reluctant duelist, a man already weary of conflict, perhaps carrying sorrows from a past before he arrived in Redemption Bluffs. The details remained hazy, colored by time and bias, but one thing was clear. It had been a tragedy born of pride, greed, and the harsh code of the frontier. As the dawn of the third day approached, a palpable tension settled over Redemption Bluffs. The air was still, the sky a pale, expectant gray. Ethan had not slept. He sat by the window of his room, the Colt Peacemaker resting on the small table beside him, the river stone from Alara clutched tightly in his hand. He thought of his father, of Alara, of Liam Thorne. He thought of the endless cycle of violence, of vengeance begetting vengeance. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through his resolve. Was this truly justice? Or was it just more pain? Another wound inflicted on a world already bleeding? But it was too late for doubts. The hour was at hand. He had made his choice, and now he had to see it through, whatever the cost. The gathering storm of his life was about to break. The walk to Whisper Creek felt like a condemned man's final journey, each step heavy with a grim finality. Ethan moved with a deliberate, almost somnambulistic calm. The turmoil within him banked down, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The early morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine from the surrounding foothills. A thin mist clung to the low-lying areas, giving the landscape an ethereal, almost dreamlike quality. Redemption Bluffs was already stirring, not with its usual workday sounds, but with a hushed, expectant murmur. Figures emerged from doorways, their faces pale in the pre-dawn light, drawn by the morbid allure of the impending duel. They kept their distance, forming a silent, straggling procession that followed Ethan and, on the other side of the wide, dusty main street, Liam Thorne, who walked with a similar stoic resolve, accompanied only by his foreman, Jed Stone, whose usual bluster was noticeably absent, replaced by a grim watchfulness. Alara was nowhere to be seen, and for that, Ethan felt a small, selfish measure of relief. He didn't want her to witness this, to see him reduced to this primitive act of retribution. Whisper Creek was a desolate spot about a mile out of town, a shallow, meandering stream fringed by willows and cottonwoods, its banks wide and flat and ideal, if somber, dueling ground. The place was aptly named. The wind, sighing through the leaves, seemed to carry faint, mournful whispers, perhaps the echoes of past confrontations, past sorrows. John Vance had indeed fallen here, a fact that lent an additional layer of bitter irony to the proceedings. As Ethan reached the designated spot, he saw that a small group had already gathered the town doctor, looking grim and resigned, and a few of the town's more prominent citizens, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and a certain grim satisfaction that this long-festering wound was finally being brought to a head. Liam Thorne arrived moments later, his face impassive. He nodded curtly to the doctor, then turned to face Ethan. The two men stood about 30 paces apart, the rising sun beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of blood orange and pale gold, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters on the dewy ground. The doctor stepped forward, his voice raspy in the morning stillness. "Gentlemen, you both know why you are here. You have both agreed to this course of action. Are there any second thoughts? Any possibility of reconciliation?" His gaze flickered between Ethan and Liam, a silent plea for sanity. Ethan's jaw tightened. Reconciliation? After 10 years of nurturing this cold fire of vengeance? After coming all this way, staking his entire existence on this single defining act? The thought was anathema. Yet, for a fleeting, treacherous moment, Alara's face flashed in his mind, her eyes full of sorrowful understanding. The smooth river stone still clutched in his hand, a small, solid weight against his palm. Liam Thorne spoke first, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the quiet air. "I regret that it has come to this, Doctor. I bear Mr. Vance no personal malice, but a challenge has been issued, and my family's honor, and indeed my own, requires me to meet it." His words were formal, almost detached. Yet Ethan detected an underlying weariness, a resignation that mirrored his own. Ethan simply shook his head in response to the doctor's question. Words were useless now. Only actions mattered. The doctor sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "Very well. The rules are simple. You will stand back to back. On my count, you will each take 10 paces. You will turn and you may fire at will. Is this understood?" Both men nodded. They moved to the center of the clearing, standing shoulder to shoulder for a moment, then back to back, the proximity unsettling, charged with a lethal intimacy. Ethan could feel the faint warmth of Liam's body, hear the soft sound of his breathing. This man, his enemy, the embodiment of all his pain, was so close, so vulnerable. The thought was a discordant note in the symphony of his rage. "Ready, gentlemen?" the doctor called out. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the waiting crowd. His hand hovered near the butt of his Colt, his fingers tingling with anticipation. This was it, the culmination of a decade of hatred, the moment of truth. "One." The doctor's voice was strained. Ethan took his first step, his boot crunching on the gravelly earth. The sun was higher now, its rays beginning to warm his back. 2. Another step. He focused on his breathing, trying to calm the tremor in his hands. 3. He could hear Liam's footsteps behind him, matching his own, steady and measured. 4. The faces of the crowd were a blur at the edge of his vision. He saw only the path ahead, the 10 paces that separated him from either vindication or oblivion. 5. Halfway there. His father's face, young and smiling, flashed in his memory. Then Alara's, her eyes pleading. 6. The river stone in his hand felt like an anchor, grounding him, yet also a weight, pulling him down. 7. The air was thick with an almost unbearable tension. He could feel the collective gaze of the onlookers, hear their shallow, indrawn breaths. 8. Almost there. His entire being was coiled like a spring, every nerve ending screaming. 9. One more step. One more moment before the world changed forever. 10. The final step. Ethan pivoted on his heel, his hand a blur as it swept down to his holster, the worn leather familiar, the grip of the Colt an extension of his own will. He saw Liam Thorne turning, a dark silhouette against the now blazing sun. Time seemed to stretch, to slow, each heartbeat an eternity. He saw the glint of sunlight on Liam's gun barrel as it came up. He saw the intense concentration on Liam's face, a mirror of his own. He saw the flicker of movement, the orange flash at the muzzle of Liam's pistol, heard the deafening roar that split the morning air, a fraction of a second before his own gun bucked in his hand. A searing pain, like a white-hot poker, tore through Ethan's left shoulder, spinning him half around, the impact stealing his breath, his vision momentarily blurring. He squeezed his own trigger more by instinct than by conscious thought, the shot going wide, kicking up dust several feet to Liam's right. He staggered, his left arm useless, a wave of nausea washing over him. He could hear shouting, women screaming, the doctor rushing forward. Through the haze of pain, he saw Liam Thorne still standing, his gun smoking, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, Liam swayed, his hand going to his side, a dark stain blossoming on his light-colored shirt. He looked down, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then his knees buckled, and he crumpled to the ground, not with a dramatic fall, but with a quiet, almost gentle collapse, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The world tilted, the sounds around Ethan fading into a dull roar as darkness began to encroach on the edges of his vision. He had been hit. Liam Thorne was down. Had he won? Had he achieved his vengeance? Or had he merely perpetuated a cycle of senseless violence, staining Whisper Creek with yet more blood, adding another tragic chapter to its mournful history? The questions swirled in his fading consciousness, unanswered, as he too sank to his knees, the cold, hard earth rushing up to meet him. Part 8. The immediate aftermath of the duel was a chaotic blur of shouting, dust, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the morning air. Ethan, kneeling in the dirt, a searing fire consuming his left shoulder, struggled to focus through the waves of pain and encroaching blackness. He saw figures rushing towards Liam Thorne, Jed Stone's anguished roar cutting through the general clamor as he reached his fallen employer first. The town doctor, his face a mask of grim urgency, was already beside Liam, tearing at his shirt, barking orders for water and bandages. Ethan felt a hand on his own uninjured arm, heard a voice, distant and distorted, urging him to stay conscious. He tried to push himself up, a desperate need to see, to understand the extent of what had happened, but his body refused to obey, a leaden weight anchoring him to the blood-soaked ground. His vision tunneled, sounds became muffled, and the world dissolved into a dizzying vortex of pain and confusion. He had a fleeting, nightmarish image of his father, lying in this very same spot, his life ebbing away. Was this his fate too? To die here, his vengeance achieved, but at what cost? The thought was a bitter pill, a cruel mockery of his decade-long quest. When Ethan regained full consciousness, he found himself lying on a narrow cot in the doctor's small, cluttered surgery, the sharp, antiseptic smell of carbolic acid filling his nostrils. Sunlight streamed through a grimy window, indicating it was much later in the day. His left shoulder was tightly bandaged, and a dull, throbbing ache had replaced the initial searing pain. He tried to sit up, a groan escaping his lips. A figure moved beside him, and he turned his head to see Alara, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze steady as she met his. "Don't try to move too much," she said softly, her voice husky with fatigue and unshed tears. "The doctor said you were lucky. The bullet passed clean through the fleshy part of your shoulder. Missed the bone, missed anything vital. You'll be laid up for a while, but you'll heal." He absorbed her words slowly, his mind still fogged. "Thorne," he managed to rasp, his throat dry. "Liam Thorne." Alara's expression tightened, a flicker of deep sorrow crossing her features. He was hit in the side. Badly. The doctor. He did everything he could. She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "Liam Thorne is dead." Ethan, the words, spoken so quietly, landed with the force of a physical blow. Dead. Liam Thorne was dead. Ethan stared at Alara, a wave of disbelief, then a strange, hollow emptiness washing over him. He had won. He had avenged his father. The man whose family had caused him so much pain was gone. This was the moment he had lived for, dreamed of, planned for. So why did he feel nothing? No triumph, no satisfaction, just a vast, aching void where his anger and grief had once resided. The fire that had consumed him for so long had finally burned itself out, leaving behind only cold, gray ashes. He said something? Alara continued, her voice barely a whisper, as if sharing a sacred confidence. Before the end. The doctor told me. Liam knew he was dying. He asked for a piece of paper. He wrote something. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, stained with what looked like dried blood. Her hand trembled as she offered it to Ethan. He told the doctor to give this to you. Only you. Ethan stared at the paper, his own hand, the one that had held the river stone, now shaking as he reached for it. His fingers fumbled with the folds, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and an inexplicable, almost desperate curiosity. The handwriting was weak, spidery, clearly penned by a man at the very edge of life. It was short, just a few lines. Vance, it began. My father, Marcus Thorne, was a hard man. He took what he wanted. The duel with your father. It was over a woman. Not land, not cards. A woman your father loved, and mine desired. He goaded your father into it. It was not a fair fight, not in spirit. I learned this truth only recently, from an old letter of my mother's. I carried his name, his legacy, but I tried to be a different man. Perhaps this bullet balances some scale. Perhaps not. The cycle, it needs to end. Forgive him if you can. Forgive me. Lt. Ethan read the note once. Then again, the words blurring through a sudden, unexpected rush of tears. A woman. His father had died over a woman he loved. A detail lost to time, or perhaps deliberately obscured. And Liam had known the truth or part of it. He had known his father was not blameless. He had carried that burden, that knowledge, into their duel. The cycle? It needs to end. Liam's dying words echoed in Ethan's mind. A profound, tragic indictment of his own actions. He had sought vengeance, believing it to be justice, but he had only succeeded in perpetuating the very cycle of violence and grief that had destroyed his own life. He had killed a man who, in his own way, might have been seeking a form of redemption. A man who was perhaps as much a victim of Marcus Thorne's legacy as Ethan was of John Vance's death. The realization was a crushing weight, a far greater pain than the physical wound in his shoulder. He looked at Alara, his eyes pleading for understanding, for absolution, for something he couldn't name. She simply met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a deep, compassionate sorrow. She didn't condemn him, nor did she offer easy comfort. She was just there, a silent witness to his unraveling, her presence a small, unwavering anchor in the storm of his despair. Jedstone and the Barham men. They're saying you murdered him, Alara said quietly, her voice pulling him back from the abyss of his thoughts. They're calling for your blood. The sheriff is trying to keep order, but this town is a powder keg, Ethan. And you're holding the match. Ethan closed his eyes. The weight of Liam's note, the weight of his actions, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had made his choice at Whisper Creek, a choice born of years of pain and a thirst for retribution. And that choice had led not to peace, not to resolution, but to more death, more grief, and a future that now seemed more uncertain, more perilous than ever before. The inner peace he had vaguely hoped for was a cruel illusion. He had killed Liam Thorne, but in doing so, he felt as though he had killed a vital part of himself, the part that Alara had so briefly, so hopefully glimpsed. The path of vengeance had led him to a desolate, barren landscape, littered with the wreckage of two lives, his own and Liam's, and the echoes of their father's tragic, unfinished business. The days following Liam Thorne's death were a blur of pain, fever, and a gnawing guilt that settled deep in Ethan's bones, heavier than any physical ailment. He remained under the doctor's care, confined to the small surgery room, while outside, The town of Redemption Bluffs seethed with a volatile mixture of grief, anger, and fear. Jed Stone, now the de facto leader of the Thorn Ranch Hands, was openly calling for Ethan's lynching. His grief for Liam twisted into a potent, vengeful rage. The sheriff, an aging, weary man named Elias Thorne, a distant, estranged cousin of Marcus, a fact that added another layer of complexity to the town's dynamics, did his best to maintain a fragile peace, posting guards outside the doctor's office, but his authority was tenuous against the rising tide of Bar M fury. Alara was a constant, quiet presence during those first critical days. She brought him food, changed his bandages when the doctor was busy, and simply sat with him, her silent companionship a lifeline in the suffocating darkness of his remorse. She never spoke of the duel, never offered judgment, but her eyes, full of a profound, sorrowful understanding, were a more potent mirror for his actions than any accuser's shout. Liam's note lay on the small table beside his cot, a constant, damning reminder. He read it over and over, each word a fresh stab of regret. The cycle, it needs to end. Liam's plea had become Ethan's torment. He had sought to honor his father's memory, but instead he had desecrated it, becoming the very thing he had despised. A man who took another's life in anger and grief. As his physical strength slowly returned, Ethan's mental anguish only deepened. He knew he couldn't stay in Redemption Bluffs. His presence was a catalyst for violence, a constant reminder of the fresh tragedy that had reopened old wounds. One evening, as Alara was tending to his shoulder, he finally spoke the words that had been circling in his mind. "I have to leave, Alara," she paused, her touch gentle on his bandaged skin. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," he admitted, the uncertainty of vast, empty space before him. "Somewhere far from here, somewhere I can try to make sense of this. Or maybe just somewhere I can forget." Alara looked at him, her gaze searching. "Can you forget, Ethan? Can you outrun what's happened here? What's inside you?" He had no answer. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the ghosts of John Vance and Liam Thorne would follow him wherever he went. The river stone she had given him was still clutched in his good hand, its smoothness a stark contrast to the jagged edges of his soul. "Liam's note," he said, his voice hoarse. "He wrote about a woman. The reason for the duel between our fathers." Alara nodded slowly. "I'd heard whispers, old tales. A schoolteacher, some said, who came to town briefly. Beautiful, spirited. Both John Vance and Marcus Thorne were taken with her. No one ever knew her name or what became of her after your father died. Marcus Thorne was a possessive man. He wouldn't have tolerated a rival." Ethan closed his eyes, a fresh wave of understanding, of sorrow, washing over him. His father's life, his own life, Liam's life, all irrevocably altered, destroyed, by a forgotten tragedy. A story of love and jealousy that had festered into decades of hatred. "This town," Alara said softly, her voice drawing him back, "it needs to heal, Ethan. Jed Stone, he's stirring up the worst in people. But there are others, many others, who are tired of the violence, tired of the Thorne legacy, whether it was Marcus's iron fist or Liam's quieter control. Liam's death, as tragic as it is, might be a chance for Redemption Bluffs to find a different path." Her words sparked a faint, unexpected idea in Ethan's mind. A path that wasn't about running, but about atonement. "What if," he began slowly, testing the thought, "what if the cycle ends not with me leaving, but with me staying? Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to try and undo some of the damage I've caused. Long enough to face what I've done." Alara looked at him, a flicker of surprise, then a dawning respect in her eyes. "That would take a different kind of courage, Ethan. More than facing a man with a gun." The decision, once spoken, settled within him with a surprising sense of rightness. It wouldn't be easy. Jed Stone and his men would be a constant threat. The town might never forgive him. But running felt like a coward's choice, another betrayal of Liam Thorne's dying wish. The next morning, against the doctor's advice, Ethan, pale and still weak but resolute, walked out of the surgery and straight to the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Elias Thorne," a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of upholding the law in a lawless land, looked up in surprise. "Vance, thought you'd be long gone by now." "I'm not running, Sheriff," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I came to tell you, I'll stand trial, if that's what the law requires. For the death of Liam Thorne." The sheriff stared at him, then slowly nodded. "It was a duel, Vance. Consensual by all accounts. Not murder, not in the eyes of the law as it stands here. But Jed Stone won't see it that way. He's got half the town riled up." "I know," Ethan said, "but I'm not going to hide. Liam Thorne. He deserved better than to die like that, over a vendetta that should have ended with our fathers." He then showed the sheriff Liam's note. Elias Thorne read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, there was a new understanding in his eyes. "Marcus was my cousin, but I never much cared for his ways," he said gruffly. "Liam, he was trying to be better than his blood." He paused. "All right, Vance. No trial for the duel. But you best watch your back. Stone won't let this go. And this town, it's got a long memory." In the days that followed, Ethan began the slow, painful process of trying to make amends, not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet actions. He offered his labor, despite his healing wound, to help repair a fence for a homesteader who had been too afraid of the thorns to fix it properly. He helped the doctor, his strength slowly returning, with tasks around the surgery. He spoke little, but his presence, his quiet determination to face the consequences of his actions, began to shift the mood in town, just a little. Jed Stone and his men still regarded him with open hostility, their threats palpable, but they were met with a growing, if hesitant, resistance from some townsfolk who were tired of the Bar M's bullying. Alara was a constant source of quiet support. She didn't coddle him, but her belief in his capacity for change was a steadying force. She helped him find work, mending tack for the livery stable, his one good hand surprisingly deft. Their relationship remained undefined, a fragile bond forged in shared sorrow and a tentative hope for a different future. He wasn't seeking redemption, not in the grand sense. He was simply trying to live with the choices he had made, to honor Liam Thorne's dying plea by trying to break the cycle, not by running from it, but by facing it, day by difficult day. The inner peace he craved still felt distant, perhaps unattainable, but in its place, a new, quieter sense of purpose was beginning to take root. He was no longer John Vance's avenging son. He was Ethan Vance, a man scarred by his past, but determined, in his own flawed way, to build a future, however uncertain, in the very town that had once been the symbol of all his hatred. The process of healing, for himself and for Redemption Bluffs, had begun, slowly, painfully, but with a fragile, persistent hope. The seasons turned in Redemption Bluffs, the harsh winter eventually surrendering to the tentative green of spring, then the full, unyielding heat of summer, each cycle a slow, inexorable turning of the page on the town's and Ethan Vance's troubled history. His decision to stay, to face the fallout of Liam Thorne's death, had been a quiet act of defiance against his own past and against the expectations of many in the town. It was a path fraught with daily reminders of his actions, the accusing glares from Jed Stone and the remaining Bar M loyalists, the hushed whispers that still followed him down the dusty main street, the constant, aching presence of Liam Thorne's memory, embodied in the blood-stained note Ethan kept carefully folded in his worn leather wallet. Yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. Ethan's quiet perseverance, his willingness to take on any honest work, no matter how menial, his refusal to be drawn into further conflict despite Stone's provocations, began to earn him a grudging respect from some, a cautious acceptance from others. He never spoke of the duel, never sought to justify his actions, but his quiet demeanor and the profound sorrow that still shadowed his eyes told a story more eloquent than any words. He worked, he endured, and in doing so he began to carve out a new, if solitary, existence. The Thorne Ranch, the Bar M, fell into a period of uncertainty after Liam's death. Jed Stone, for all his bluster, lacked Liam's foresight and business acumen. Infighting among the senior hands and a series of poor decisions saw the ranch's influence begin to wane, its power slowly eroding like a sandstone cliff under the persistent wind. This decline, paradoxically, seemed to lessen some of the overt hostility towards Ethan. Stone, preoccupied with his own struggles, had less time and energy for vengeance. Alara remained his most steadfast ally, their bond deepening through shared silences and unspoken understanding. She never pushed him, never demanded more than he was ready to give, but her quiet faith in him was a constant source of strength. He found himself spending more time at her small holding, helping her with the endless chores, finding a measure of peace in the simple, honest labor of tilling the soil, mending fences, caring for her animals. In her presence, the ghosts of his past seemed to recede, their mournful whispers momentarily silenced by the gentle rhythm of a life lived in harmony with the land. He learned from her the quiet courage of resilience, the profound strength found not in violence or retribution, but in the stubborn, daily act of choosing hope over despair, creation over destruction. He started to truly see the town of Redemption Bluffs, not as a stage for his vengeance, but as a community of flawed, struggling individuals, each carrying their own burdens, their own hopes. He saw the kindness beneath the rough exteriors, the yearning for peace and stability that lay hidden beneath years of hardship and fear. He began to understand that redemption wasn't a grand, dramatic absolution, but a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding, of making amends, not just to others but to oneself. One cool autumn evening, almost a year after the duel, Ethan found himself standing once more at Whisper Creek. The willows and cottonwoods were shedding their golden leaves, which drifted down to carpet the ground where he and Liam Thorne had faced each other. He no longer felt the burning rage or the crushing guilt that had once consumed him here. Instead, there was a profound, melancholic acceptance. He had taken a life, a truth he would carry with him always, but he had also been given a chance Liam had been denied, to try and live a different kind of life, to honor his plea that the cycle end. He took out Liam's note, its creases soft and familiar from countless readings. He didn't need to read the words. They were etched into his soul. He then took out the smooth river stone Alara had given him. He held one in each hand, the fragile paper and the solid stone, symbols of the past and the tentative, fragile hope for the future. He wouldn't forget Liam Thorne or his own father. Their memories were a part of him, a somber reminder of the cost of hatred and the enduring power of choices. But he would no longer let those memories define him, no longer allow them to dictate his path. He looked towards the town, the lights of Redemption Bluffs twinkling in the gathering dusk like scattered stars. It was not a perfect place, nor was he a perfect man. But it was here, in this unlikely, harsh corner of the world, that he had found a chance to begin again, to sow seeds of peace where once he had only sown sorrow. He turned and began the walk back, not towards a future free of pain or regret, for some scars never truly fade, but towards a future he could choose, a future where resilience, connection, and perhaps even a quiet, hard-won inner peace might be possible. The path ahead was still uncertain, the lessons learned paid for in blood and grief, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ethan Vance walked not as a man consumed by the shadows of his past, but as a man tentatively, humbly, stepping into the light of a new dawn, carrying not the burden of vengeance, but the quiet resolve to build something worthy of the sacrifices that had been made, to truly allow the cycle to end, and to perhaps, finally, find his own form of redemption, not in a blaze of glory, but in the steady, earnest rhythm of a life lived with intention and a hard-earned, fragile hope.